Hi, everybody. I'm going to share today some thoughts I've had while I've been gardening the last couple of months. It's been a busy time and things are thriving out there. In fact, this year, maybe I'll have some pictures of this, but I'm pretty happy with pumpkins and several other plants that I have going. And so I haven't been doing as many Substack articles or as active on sharing content, and I wanted to get a short video in as kind of my main summer input. Okay, so let's get started. Uh, Really, I want to theme today's discussion around what I would call ecological stewardship. Um, Stewardship could be considered also guardianship or being the custodian of the ecology or the protector or the caretaker. I like caretaker a lot. But there are three key themes here that I could call the three pillars of ecological stewardship, and I'm going to share those. But I'm going to start here because when I launched Holobiont Hub over a year ago now, this was one of the original graphics that I developed to explain how holobionts work. Uh, Really, it's a Venn diagram showing this small space where you have an overlap between active allies. That's sort of what we collectively call microorganisms. We could also call some of them mesoorganisms, like earthworms. And then there's effective hosts. In the context of gardening, that's usually the plants themselves. And then also the supportive conditions. So I want you to keep this in mind as we go forward because I'm going to reference it. Now, in my opinion, about a third of the story of ecological stewardship is going to come down to just quality bioamendments. That's how you get that active ally piece back into the equation. And I am not using the term composting as much as I can these days. I'm avoiding that. I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with compost, but I'd like people to reach past compost to achieve what's really a bioamendment. And part of the discussion that often goes on in online spaces is around the use of a microscope, because if we want to see these tiny organisms, and know if we have these active allies, there is a great value in having a tool such as a microscope. I mean, it's just amazing. However, I think that there has been an overemphasis of coming up with quantitative data, so to speak, and that relates probably into a larger thing I need to write about at some point, which is, in my opinion, the misuse of the term research. Really, what we're trying to do often in our gardens, especially in a backyard context, but even at commercial scale, is run practical field trials and tinker in very thoughtful ways. And the microscope can provide us insights into what's actually happening with the microorganisms that we can't see with our eyes. But the second that it is attempted, that there's an attempt to turn that into universal information or come up with numbers that would apply in all soil types and climates and conditions, I get pretty skeptical. I'm pretty skeptical of microscopy as a quote unquote scientific tool, but I'm very pro the use of microscopes as a practical piece of reconnaissance, right? To scout what's happening in our compost, sorry, our bioamendment that we've created, or around the roots of the plants that we're growing. Okay, that was a bit of a caveat. So I want to move on to what bioamendments really are. I think of them as practical probiotics. So in many cases where we're gardening or growing food, even at commercial scale, the land has been sort of misused and abused previously. I do a lot of my gardening in a suburban setting, and all of the houses around here, I know for a fact that the native soil and plant materials and microbes were scraped off, and then new fresh dirt was brought in, and then typically like a non-native grass lawn was established. Um, and so I have managed in many places to kill off that grass lawn and replace it with something I'm happier with because I'm not a huge fan of lawns. But these are just a few examples of some of the different ways that we can bring life back into these systems. So this year I've gotten into making my own bokashi flakes. That's that picture where my hand is quite dirty with the those are in this case wheat bran that I've inoculated. So one of the few commercial products that I will use, I prefer to use local or what's sometimes called indigenous microorganisms. And you'll especially be familiar with that term if you follow like natural farming methods. In the middle picture here, this sort of donut that I have, surrounded by insulating straw, is the first attempt that I've made to develop something similar to a Johnson Sioux compost pile, and I'm very happy with the results. You can actually see that sort of chimney in the center of it, or the hole of the donut that will allow oxygen to diffuse into the materials. Now, previously, I had done quite a bit of thermophilic composting or hot composting, and you can actually see me turning a pile and the steam coming off of that on a cool fall day. The biggest frustration I have with how these things are discussed online is that people will pick a style or a camp and then defend it against all others or say all other kinds of bioamendment are wrong. That is not how any of this works. Everything is contextual, everything is a different tool. And integrating hot composting or mesophilic composting or anaerobic uh, fermentation, biofermentation, these are all completely valid opportunities. In fact, I'm exploring even more into the natural farming world and many of the other products that are made there, many of which are anaerobic processes. I have just a few more pictures of some of what I've been doing as a form of bioamendment in my garden. So, Riley's actually on top of that big compost donut, which for winter here, our winter months, really October through March, are quite cold, especially at night, and we'll get hard freezes. So I put all these extra leaves and tarps on top of that pile, and I was able to keep the temperature, the interior temperature, quite moderate because I already had worms that just naturally came from other areas and found the materials I was working with and were already part of this pile. And so I'm happy to say that at its hottest, it only got up to about 30 Celsius, which is about 90 Fahrenheit. And that pile is now hosting six pumpkin vines. So this is actually not only do I get to enjoy, having these pumpkins when they form, but there's kind of like an input or a nourishment of any of the microbial life in that pile. And honestly, they remind me to add water. Well, I set up a drip irrigation system to do it automatically, but if I saw the pumpkins indicating to me that something wasn't right, I would try to figure out what was possibly going wrong with that entire compost pile. And then this final picture is some of the liquid amendments that I use. I do apply organic fertilizers in my garden at key times in the development of my plants. Some people are quite anti-fertilization, or it just depends. I'd like to make more of my fertilizers here on my property in the future, but I was able to buy a, relatively inexpensive product that I thought would be beneficial. I've also added, you can see in the sort of the bottom of this picture, I will take some mature worm compost, usually mix water about 1-to-1 ratio, and then strain it through a stainless steel honey filter so that a lot of the organisms in that will come through the filter, and then I'll add those as I'm fertilizing as well. There's lots of other things I tinker with, but this is where I'm at right now. And so that all fits under pillar one, which is we need to restore those tiny allies. Again, I mean, even on a year-to-year basis, there can be a bloom and a dieback of microorganisms in our soil. And so I like to bump up with those kind of practical probiotics constantly. And because I'm using materials and processes that bring in things from my local bioregion, I feel that the microorganisms I'm adding are more well adapted to these circumstances. I'm in Idaho, so it's high desert gardening. I wouldn't even have a garden if I didn't have drip irrigation. So uh, this is like I said before, about one third of the story that I'm trying to tell out there with my ecological stewardship is um, perfecting, reaching for a higher value bioamendment and process, creating that, deploying it constantly throughout the year. So let's move on to the next third of the story. And in my original graphic with the holobiont kind of nexus here, this encompasses what I'd call effective hosts. So another way of saying this is we need a thriving scaffold. We need, in this case, I've got a picture of echinacea, which I grow plenty of. Some people call it coneflower, is a common name. And that plant provides the structure on which the microbiome assembles, right? So holobionts are hosts plus their microbiomes. It's a biological community that we can think of in a holistic fashion. But the plant has a really key role here as sort of the anchor for that entire process. And plants provide the majority of energy to the microorganisms as well, to everything else in the food web, all the arthropods and other things. Most of what we consume, even if you're a fungus, most of what you consume came through an autotroph at some point. And in terrestrial systems, a lot of that is through plants, which probably explains why plants and microorganisms together comprise almost 90% of the weight of all life found on Earth, right? It's really a planet of the plants and microorganisms, the plant having an important role as a host, the microorganisms having numerous important roles through the soil food web and how all of that interacts to nourish the plant and protect it. So let's think about hosts for a minute. I have a few pictures here from my garden this year. I have had an issue in numerous circumstances with pill bugs, which are, as far as I know, a naturally occurring terrestrial crustacean. Uh, However, I have created the perfect circumstances here in the high desert to create like an oasis for them. And I often do get in the early spring a bloom of population, and they will actually eat plants. They're quite content for the most part to live off of the organic materials around them. They hide under the straw that I use as mulch. But I have come out, especially at night, and found this kind of, oh, this looks like an infestation. I will say that this zucchini plant is now big enough and its leaves are high enough that I'm not seeing this kind of herbivory anymore. However, it is a factor. And when I see this and the destruction of the solar collecting leaf, right? This is where the energy is intercepted from sunlight and turned into the chemical energy of plant sugars and shared with microorganisms. So I'm not trying to eliminate my pill bugs, but I will antagonize them a little bit. I will fight back. I will primarily try to protect my plants. So this middle picture is one of the bean plants that I got established this year. They're doing quite well out there, probably 30, 40 centimeters in height now. But when they were little, especially in the past, I've had pill bugs utterly destroy them, chew off the stem so that the whole plant dies. And I had a friend suggest to me that I get a little bit of wool and tuck it around the base of the plant, like I could call it a wool donut, perhaps, and that the pill bugs actually don't like to crawl over this wool and attack the plant. And this is true. My beans this year are basically untouched by anything. Now, I have had slugs crawl across the wool and attack some plants. I've lost a couple of plants this year, but nothing like in previous years. So I am protecting the scaffold. I am making sure that the plants are robust and thriving. I have one more example because it's kind of an interesting one, but you see in this pot here next to some marigolds that I planted is a cotton plant. I just quite interested in cotton and have seen it growing in large fields in many different countries. And I produced a couple last year and have been working on two this year as well. So this cotton is highly susceptible to damage if the weather gets turns cold, and we tend to have cold nights even in spring. In fact, anytime you're seeing the temperature drop below about 15 Celsius, which is around 60 Fahrenheit, it starts to become a worry for cotton. It's just not evolved in those kinds of environments. It doesn't have tolerance to the cold, to even a chill in the air. And so, in order to protect this seedling, I kept covering it up with a small pot at night. Whenever the temperatures were going to drop, I mean, they got down to around 9 Celsius a few nights in June. And this would have completely died, I think, under those conditions, or been terribly harmed. But as it is, I only had a few leaves with a little cold damage on one of my plants because I thought about its range of tolerance and kind of empathized with the plant and um, what it would prefer, and gave it those conditions to the best of my ability. In this case, just by putting it to bed with a little cover. Okay, so the whole other side of this conversation, and this might be quite a nerdy topic to bring up, but a lot of the research I was doing when I was still part of academia uh, culminated in sort of this discussion. The paper that I've cited here that you can look up, it's open access. And I've given you figure one as well because this was the first time back in like 2020, 2021 is when we were writing this paper. Um, it's the first time I really engaged with the concept of the holobiont, and I thought through our breeding programs, which often divide out the plant and focus on the plant genome or genetic um, conditions, as opposed to thinking holistically about the biological community. And so, what we say in this paper is that we need to alter our breeding protocols. And this is one of the reasons why I'm quite happy that there is a local seed company here in my area that tries to sell various locally adapted varieties of all my garden vegetables and other plants that I would be interested in for a landscape. Um, I'm part of a garden club partially so I can tap into this as well. Which varieties or cultivars are going to have the best time based on these local conditions? And really, this idea goes back years ago to when I read the book Darwinian Agriculture, which I highly recommend. Um, Brings up an understanding not just of plants, but of animals and the ways that we are kind of refining their genetics through artificial selection, but maybe also turning off some of their ability to be thrifty and to cooperate with microorganisms. And a lot of the research that I did when I was part of academia was around those topics. Okay, so this summarizes, if I'm to try to summarize this, it's pillar two of ecological stewardship is nurture the hosts, right? To really think of them as whether they're animals or plants, to think of them as really important to care for them. And you may not be willing to baby all of your plants the way I am, to run out there and cover them on cold nights and things. However, in general, if you completely ignore them, you may be disappointed that they're consumed by some sort of antagonistic organism, or that they're simply die because they're beyond their environmental range of tolerance. All right, we're going to move on to the last third of the story, which I'm kind of calling a safe environment, right? And when I previously presented this at the launch party, I said we have to ensure supportive conditions, right? So the picture I have here is one I took in my backyard of some hollyhocks. And I planted these last year because it was the second season. Maybe the first season was only half a season, but it was the second spring that I had been working on the landscape around them, which started off looking like the surface of Mars or the moon. It was dry, it was dirt, and it was under this pine tree that had probably sucked up all the moisture for a long time, and nothing else was really thriving there. And I had to come in and remediate that environmental um, kind of harsh environment and get the microorganisms reestablished and do things with cover crops and other things just to start to create a nice, like, if you think of soil as the skin of planet Earth, I was acting like the soil's dermatologist in this regard, and helping it heal. And as a result, this year now, we have these beautiful hollyhocks. There's other colors coming up now, and it it owes a lot of its existence, the plant and the microorganisms there, the holistic holobiont would not be there without having a safe environment. So this is one of my favorite quotes by Aldo Leopold, and this is the second book I highly recommend that you get a hold of and read if you have the chance, because Aldo was really seeing these things in the early 1900s, prior to even more of the damage and such that has occurred in our world and through agriculture. And in this quote, he says, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. This is the way I assess what's going on. Am I preserving the integrity, stability, and beauty of my biological community? Or am I doing something which maybe helps the plant but hurts the microorganisms? That's not going to be sustainable in the long term. Or maybe I try something and I know that it has these off-target effects. Like I've got a pest that I have to deal with. And so I use an organic spray, and then I come back and try to restore anything that that spray may have disturbed in that system. So, yeah, I think it's a really important place to say, like, we have a pathway to follow. We have indicators of whether or not we're getting this right. I'm seeing this filter from the backyard experimenters, tinkerers, I should say, like myself, all the way up into commercial agriculture. And I'm lucky to be friends with a number of farmers and ranchers from across the spectrum of management principles. And increasingly, this idea is coming home to alter the systems around us. In this case, I've pulled the quote from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the US Department of Agriculture, to show that, like, we're kind of getting past this idea of, soil is just something for plants to hold on to, right? But rather seeing it as an ecosystem and a foundation of everything else we do. And so, though I don't use the term regenerative very often anymore, uh, I still find the principles that are sometimes called regenerative principles. Previously, the NRCS, I think, called them the soil health principles as well. I find it really meaningful that as we understand our context, so many of our fights, so many of the arguments that happen online are because people are talking about a different context. And I go, well, you're both kind of right and you're both kind of wrong because maybe it works over here, but not there. Then, you get into these things like minimizing soil disturbance, increasing diversity, keeping the soil covered, the year-round root in the soil, integrating livestock, which, I don't have cattle coming through my garden, but I have a lot of composting worms. They're a kind of, I call it tiny below ground livestock. And I would be interested in integrating other animals. Some people run ducks in their garden, for example. But this set of tools doesn't prescribe exactly what you should do for your context. It says, reach for these principles, tinker and find out. I think it's probably in some ways, I won't say the deepest pillar, but you could spend your entire life looking into different nuances of management in this way and never get to the end of the knowledge pool. I mean, we as humans collectively know so little, but this is a key. And it's part of why I'd say it fits under that third pillar: create a safe environment, utilizing ideas like these. Okay, so that takes us to pillar three, which I would really call care for the land. And, some people may say, oh, you backyard gardener working on 100 square meters, which is about 1,000 square feet, don't really, it's not even land. Well, I'm producing food for my neighbors and my family, and I'm doing the critical thing that so many voices within indigenous communities are calling the rest of us to do, which is to reconnect with the life around us and to see ourselves as those guardians and protectors and stewards of all the life. And so even the organisms that I don't want in high abundance here, I I still think of them as part of the equation. Even those things which are kind of antagonists that I have to sort of block out from my seedlings until they get big enough to resist them. Um, it's all important. It's evolved. It's part of our biosphere. And I would just affirm that care for all of life is care for the land. The land, used in the way that Aldo and others have talked about it, is the space, but it's also all the organisms and all of the other forces and processes that collectively comprise that. So whether it's small or thousands of hectares, this is an important piece. Okay, this is my final slide, and it's kind of a summary of what I've talked about today. I've brought the graphic back up to remind you that healthy holobionts, it's about finding the overlap of these three primary ideas. And what goes along with that is three pillars. Because we need active allies to have a healthy holobiont, we need to take action to restore those tiny allies. That's really going to be through producing great bioamendments and using them effectively. And then because we need thriving hosts or effective hosts, we need to nurture the plants or animals that, not separate them from their microbiomes, which is kind of historically what we did, but think of them as, again, like sort of the framework or the skeleton on which the rest of the life assembles. And then we can't accomplish either of those things, to the fullest extent without caring for the land or influencing things to have these really supportive conditions. And I use the word influence quite intentionally here because I think a lot of the agricultural paradigm, the gardening paradigm that's out there is about control. And it's one of the reasons why, like, broad spectrum pesticides are used so often because we want to control and knock things out and get rid of the stuff we don't like. But actually, we need to be much more focused on like a positive influence because many of the organisms that can become a big problem and harm the plants or animals in our care, they will not do so if we have a robust community that's already there. If we have really achieved a healthy, thriving kind of holobiont through our ecological stewardship, then there's an exclusion of too many organisms that would cause harm. This is even something in the medical literature we're discovering about the human gut, and it's one of the reasons I take a scientifically verified probiotic every day. Is I want like a teeming um, mass of all kinds of diverse organisms that can exclude something really aggressive that comes along, right? They can collectively fight back. And we're talking about things that are published in Nature and Science and very high tier journals here with these principles. So we don't want to consider that anything is unimportant in the equation, but rather that we have the ability through the various ways of discovering the world that humans have access to influence the assemblage in our land of hosts and microbiomes. And that is not a negative thing to do because we can create very healthy, thriving cucumber plants or tomato plants. I have a bunch out a few 100 feet away from me as I stand here right now doing their thing. They do it without me for the most part, but I just shepherd a little bit. I just bump the system or guide it in a few key directions. And that seems like the right relationship to me, at least at this point. So I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of technical information here today. And we'll see you out there in the community. Cheers.